There are musicians who flame out in public, and there are others who simply vanish into shadow, leaving the audience staring at an empty stage. Sue Tissue belongs to the latter category. Her disappearance was so total that it eventually eclipsed her work, turning a brief incandescent career into one of underground rock's most enduring riddles. She sang as if language itself were malfunctioning, stood motionless while chaos unfolded around her, and recoiled from attention at the very moment it found her. For a few short years she was unavoidable. Then she was gone. Welcome to Rock and Roll Mysteries. Sue Tissue was born Sue McLean in the late 1950s, a name that suggests Midwestern ordinariness rather than art punk provocation. Public records and later recollections place her birth in Minneapolis, though the details of her family life remain elusive, as if the trail goes deliberately cold before it even begins. What is clear is that McLean showed an early pull toward music and art, less toward performance than toward experimentation. Friends and collaborators would later describe her not as a budding rock singer, but as someone instinctively drawn to sound, structure, and disruption. Even the name she eventually adopted, Sue Tissue, seemed to be smirking naughtily, disposable, domestic, and faintly absurd. It was not the name of someone planning to be taken seriously in the traditional sense, and that was the point. By the mid-1970s, McLean was already circling the edges of what would soon be called New Wave. In 1976, still barely out of her teens, she briefly formed a band called the Technocrats, with Chan Poling and Bede Cheney, two musicians who would soon return to Minneapolis and form the acclaimed group The Suburbs. The Technocrats left little recorded evidence behind, but their existence places McLean squarely inside a loose, art-driven network of young musicians who viewed rock not as rebellion for rebellion's sake, but as a conceptual playground. This was music as collage, irony, and performance art. McLean fit easily into that world. Her real transformation began in 1978 when she enrolled at the California Institute of the Arts, or CalArts, at precisely the moment when Los Angeles punk was splintering into stranger, more hybrid forms. Hardcore bands were raging in suburban garages and VFW halls, but another current was flowing alongside them. Art school punks who treated the 3-minute song as an absurdist exercise rather than a political weapon. CalArts was a crucible for that mindset, and it was there that McLean met bassist William Ranson, who rechristened himself Vex Billingsgate. Together they began experimenting with sound, structure, and persona. The earliest incarnations of their band went by names like Art Attack and The Fabulons, titles that sounded less like rock groups than half-finished conceptual jokes. Rehearsals took place in a rented former storefront in Long Beach, which doubled as living space, practice room, and social hub. Friends drifted in and out. Instruments were shared. Nothing about the project suggested permanence. Then gradually a lineup coalesced. McLean on vocals and keyboards, Ranson on bass, Richard Whitney, soon to be Frankie Ennui, on guitar, Charles Rodriguez, dubbed Chuck Roast, on drums, and John McBurney, aka John Glur, on lead guitar. Each adopted a pseudonym, turning the band itself into a living installation piece. They called themselves Suburban Lawns. A quick aside to let you know about my other podcast series, Rock and Roll Histories. In this extra show, I'm currently going through a 5-part series, looking at the most important musical events of the year 1965, season by season, and picking out some gems from what was a marvelous year in rock music. If you want to have a listen and support Rock and Roll Mysteries at the same time, be sure to have a look at the tiers both here as a YouTube member and over on Patreon. I recently launched a new tier at $3 or £3 a month, which gives you the podcast, and there are higher tiers for some lovely extra perks. Many thanks to all who have signed up and for all the comments and chat we have over on Patreon. Your support is what keeps this channel alive. Right, back to the show. The name Suburban Lawns was a joke, but one with teeth. Actual suburban lawns were symbols of conformity, maintenance, and quiet desperation, green rectangles manicured into submission. Suburban Lawns, the band, existed to tear up that surface and peer underneath, a la David Lynch a few years later in Blue Velvet. Their songs were short, sharp, and deliberately strange, borrowing from surf music, jerky new wave rhythms, and post-punk angularity. McLean, now fully Sue Tisho, stood at the center delivering lyrics in a voice that seemed pointedly untrained, oscillating between monotone chant and sudden, almost involuntary shrieks. She did not perform charisma. She barely performed at all. Their first single, Gidget Goes to Hell, released in 1979, encapsulated everything unsettling and funny about the band. It took the wholesome surf culture archetype of Gidget and sent her straight to damnation, a satire so blunt it looped back around into surrealism. The song might have remained a regional curiosity, if not for an unlikely ally, filmmaker Jonathan Demme. Drawn to the band's off-kilter humor, Demme directed a low-budget music video that played the concept straight, ending with the bikini-clad heroine's implied shark attack. Somehow, miraculously, that video aired on Saturday Night Live in early 1980. Overnight, Suburban Lawns went from art school oddity to national curiosity. Viewers across America watched a band that did not look or sound like anything else on television. There was no swagger, no rebellion for sale, no clear emotional cue. Sue Tisho stood primly dressed, expression unreadable, as if daring the audience to project meaning onto her silence. It worked, or rather, it confused, and confusion in that moment was a form of power. The band followed quickly with Janitor, a song built around a misunderstanding that became legend. The infamous line, "I'm a janitor, oh my genitals," was born from a misheard remark between friends, transformed into a chorus that sounded obscene, childish, and strangely scientific all at once. Performed live, it became something stranger still. In footage from 1980, Sue Tisho barely moves as she delivers the line, her face blank, her voice flat, while the band lurches around her. The effect is hypnotic. Critics struggled to describe it. One wrote rather cleverly that while her voice, quote, went to Mars, her body remained in its own private Idaho. This was not an act. Bandmates would later insist that what audiences saw on stage was simply Sue being Sue, unvarnished, uncalculated, and utterly uninterested in meeting expectations. She wore thrift-stored dresses that made her look like a time traveler from another century. She stared past audiences rather than into them. Some reviewers wondered aloud whether she was possessed or unhinged. Others sensed something braver, a refusal to perform femininity, accessibility, or even likability on cue. In 1981, Suburban Lawns released their self-titled debut album on IRS Records, a label known for spotting left-of-center talent. The record was taut, funny, and disorienting, a collection of songs that sounded awake in a city many described as numb. Surf riffs collided with new wave stiffness. Lyrics jumped from sci-fi paranoia to suburban satire. It was not punk, not pop, not art rock in any tidy sense. It was simply itself. The band suddenly found themselves opening for acts like Susie and the Banshees, The Clash, and U2, strange bedfellows who nonetheless recognized something electric in their presence. As attention grew, so did the press's fixation on Sue Tisho herself, and this is where friction set in. Journalists wanted a frontwoman. They wanted a quote machine, a narrative, a hook they could package. What they got instead was a resistance. In a 1981 interview with the Los Angeles Times, Sue answered questions sparingly, if at all, finally declaring that, quote, interviews are obsolete. When pressed on her role as the band's focal point, she bristled, insisting that singling her out misunderstood the project entirely. "I like music more than I like talking," she said with a flatness that could not be spun. To some writers, this read as arrogance. To others, it felt like something rarer, a genuine refusal to participate in the machinery of fame. Sue Tisho did not want to be explained, contextualized, or decoded. She wanted the work to exist and then to be left alone. In a scene increasingly hungry for attention, even underground attention, that stance made her anomalous. By 1982, Suburban Lawns had reached their peculiar peak, a cult band with national exposure, critical fascination, and a frontwoman who seemed actively allergic to all of it. Behind the scenes, strain was building. Creative differences surfaced. Touring wore thin. The conceptual framework that had once felt liberating began to feel like a trap. When guitarist John Gleur left during the recording of their 1983 Baby EP, it was a shock to the system. The EP failed to land with the force of the debut. Momentum stalled. What followed was abrupt and unsettling. Suburban Lawns disbanded in 1983, leaving behind a single album, a handful of singles, and an aura of unfinished business. And then, even more startlingly, Sue Tissue cut off contact with her bandmates entirely. No farewell interviews, no explanations. One day she was there, the next, unreachable. For most artists, this would have been a pause. For Sue Tissue, it was the beginning of something else entirely. When Suburban Lawns ended, it did not unravel slowly. It just stopped. For the remaining members, the band's collapse felt abrupt but survivable. A disappointment folded into the usual churn of early 1980s underground life. For Sue Tissue, it was something closer to severance. She did not merely leave the group, she withdrew from it entirely, cutting off communication with people who had shared years of rehearsal rooms, touring vans, and creative risk. One day, she was present, peculiar, magnetic, the next, unreachable. The disappearance unsettled those who knew her. Chuck Roast would later say, without drama, that he had never seen or heard from her again. Frankie Ennui echoed the same disbelief. There was no fight, no dramatic ultimatum, just absence. It was as though the persona of Sue Tissue had fulfilled its purpose and could now be discarded, like the name itself. What remained was Sue McLean, a private individual uninterested in explaining the difference. Rather than drift aimlessly after the band's end, McLean made a decisive pivot. She moved to Boston and enrolled at Berklee College of Music, a choice that startled those who still associated her with deadpan punk surrealism. Berklee was not a place for irony or spectacle. It was a place of scales, theory, and discipline. There, McLean focused on piano and composition, stripping music back to structure rather than persona. For someone who had been treated as a visual and cultural curiosity, this retreat into formal study felt pointed. It was not a rejection of music, but a rejection of its framing. During this period, she composed what would become Salon de Musique, a 3-movement instrumental piano suite, recorded in 1982 and quietly released 2 years later. The record bore almost no resemblance to Suburban Lawns. There were no vocals, no satire, no performance. The pieces unfolded slowly, minimalist in temperament, circling motifs rather than punching ideas forward. If Suburban Lawns had been jagged and confrontational, Salon de Musique was inward and severe, more aligned with modern classical traditions than any rock lineage. Only a small number of copies were pressed, and the album passed unnoticed at the time, surfacing later as a whispered artifact, proof that Sue Tissue's musical instincts had always been broader than her public image suggested. It was also, in retrospect, a closing statement. After Salon de Musique, there was no further recorded music, no hint of another project incubating offstage. McLean did not attempt to reconcile her art punk past with her classical interests, nor did she court a new audience. She completed the work, released it with minimal fanfare, and stepped back again. For most musicians, such a release would have been a prelude. For her, it was just a bit of punctuation. Her final known public appearance came not in music, but on film. In 1986, Jonathan Demme, who had once helped catapult Suburban Lawns into the national consciousness, cast her in a brief role in Summing Wild. She appears as Peggy Dillman, a pregnant housewife in a tiny Uncle Sam hat, delivering a moment of awkward, off-kilter comedy opposite Hollywood stars. The scene is fleeting but unmistakable. The same strange gravity is there, the same refusal to telegraph intent. It feels less like acting than a controlled leak of personality. And then, nothing. No interviews followed. No re-emergence. No updates. After Something Wild's release, Sue Tissue vanished completely from public life. Not faded, not retired, vanished. In the decades that followed, this silence became its own narrative. Fans of suburban lawns, initially few, then gradually more numerous, began to ask the obvious question: what happened to her? The absence of any clear answer only sharpened the fascination. Unlike many cult figures of the pre-internet era, Sue Tissue left behind almost no trail. Even former collaborators had nothing new to offer. She seemed to have executed a near-perfect withdrawal. By the early 2000s, her disappearance had transformed into a kind of obsession within certain corners of music culture. Message boards filled with speculation, blogs ran essays with titles that framed her life as a mystery to be solved. Some assumed she had died. Others imagined radical reinvention, a suburban domestic life, a teaching career, a profession far removed from art entirely. Each theory said more about the storyteller than the subject. As interest intensified, so did unease. The search for Sue Tissue began to resemble a true crime fixation without a crime. Fans passing public records, tracing name variations, and following false leads. What had once been curiosity edged toward intrusion. A counter-narrative emerged in response, arguing that the very absence people found so compelling should be respected, that a refusal to be visible was not an invitation to hunt, but a boundary. In the late 2010s, a fan claimed to have located Sue McClain and made contact. Instead of announcing a revelation, he shut down his search, stating that she wished to remain private and that her choice should be honored. The moment passed quietly. There was no confirmation, no denial, no photograph, just a reaffirmation of the silence that had defined her post-1980s existence. Meanwhile, the work she left behind grew louder. Suburban Lawn's Lone album was reissued decades after its release, greeted not as a curiosity, but as a minor classic. Critics reassessed it with fresh ears, hearing in its stiff rhythms and surreal humor an early articulation of ideas that would later surface in post-punk, indie, and experimental pop. Younger listeners discovered Janitor not as a novelty, but as a template for the kind of Kurt Cobain-style deadpan resistance, seen more often after the 90s, an early refusal to entertain on command. Salon de Musique, once nearly impossible to find, circulated digitally and astonished those who encountered it without context. The idea that the same person who sang "Oh My Genitals" with a blank stare had also written austere minimalist piano compositions only deepened the sense that Sue Tissue had been misread from the start. She had not been playing dumb or strange, she had been exact. Her influence, such as it is, does not resemble lineage in the usual sense. Few artists sound like her, fewer still attempt to. Instead, her presence lingers as a kind of permission slip. It's a permission to disengage from the performance of identity, permission to walk away without explanation, permission to let the work stand alone and refuse its own myth-making. In an industry built on visibility and continuity, Sue Tissue offered a different model: intensity without longevity, impact without accumulation. She did not burn out in public or self-destruct. She simply stopped, and by stopping so completely, she exposed how unusual it is for artists, especially women, to deny the audience ongoing access. Today, Sue Tissue occupies a peculiar place in cultural memory. She is spoken of as if she were gone, though she is not. Her absence has become a form of presence, a reminder that not every story requires a third act, played out under lights. Some end mid-sentence, some end exactly where the artist chooses. What remains is a brief, sharp body of work, created by someone who seemed acutely aware of how easily identity hardens into costume. Sue Tissue slipped out of hers before it could calcify. In doing so, she left behind something rarer than a career, a refusal that still unsettles decades later, precisely because it was never explained. Alright, that's about all there is on the mysterious Sue Tissue. My thanks to the commenter who requested this one a few weeks back. It was a great shout. I hope you enjoyed it. She might not be someone you've heard of, but I'd recommend checking out a few tunes, especially if you like art rock and early post-punk. Anyway, I've been Chester, cheers, and be sure to drop back next week for another episode.